Alright, welcome to my Greyspace preparation guide. So, there's a couple things that you need to know before we talk about the Greyspace. First thing, you can't enter the Greyspace if you're in a team. Then, you're also going to have 6 random spawns throughout the map. And while you're inside the Greyspace, you can't teleport or die, otherwise you get kicked out. But once you're in there, you only have 8 minutes to explore, fight, or do whatever you want inside the Greyspace. And last but not least, you want to have a plan. I strongly recommend that you use an interactive map so that way you can mark off what you find on the map. Now, I'm going to go ahead and leave a link to this interactive map down in the descriptions, but there was something that I did want to show you. If you notice right here, we have Dark Zone and Gray Zone. So I believe Dark Zone most likely comes out in a future patch, so you want to go ahead and cut all that off. And this is what you're actually having to deal with. A good tip that I believe is going to be very helpful for you is that you want to focus on either hunting down space rifts or just going after the dust. So my recommendations on which one should you choose. If you're fairly strong, maybe like a whale or a dolphin, you can go ahead and try to do the space rifts because some of these are pretty difficult, especially the bosses. But if you're lacking in power, you might want to just kind of go around, collect the dust, and hopefully after getting all that dust, you can maybe get yourself a little bit more power. So before going into the Greyspace, there's a few things that you want to prepare before going inside. I strongly recommend that you have a weapon set that's going to be your strongest team. On top of that, you want to have a weapon that has a high shatter rate. Almost every monster in the Greyspace has a shield, and it's just going to slow you down if you're trying to attack most of those monsters without being able to shield break. Then if you have something like Claudia and you maybe have a movement set so that way you can get around faster, that can also work too. And if you do have Claudia and you don't have the Claudia macro, I'll go ahead and display that for you now. But I also want to go ahead and let you know that if you're going to be trying to go around with Claudia, sometimes it might not work because you're confined in a small area, and when monsters are loading, that messes up your FPS. Also, you do want to make sure that your FPS is set to 120, and a lot of times Claudia might target monsters, so you end up kind of losing time. So I recommend that you don't fully rely on Claudia as your only way to get around. And another thing that I quickly wanted to mention were settings. You could consider lowering down your settings because in the Greyspace, since all those monsters have to load in there, it can kind of lower down your FPS. So you might want to consider maybe changing it to balance, at least for when you do the Greyspace. And on top of that, I want to give you another warning about this enabled DLSS. I already talked about that in a previous video, but if you're having memory issues, this is kind of the main cause. Hopefully they get that fixed soon, but for me, I just leave this off. So let's go ahead and talk about Relics, starting with the Explorer set. Now this is a set you mainly want to use if you're just trying to go for the dust and avoid the space rifts. The first thing that I would probably get is Kuant, and ideally if you can have a Kuant level 3, that's going to help you because once the shield breaks, it's going to give you a movement speed boost. But if you have at least a level 2, once that shield breaks, you will get a damage boost and you will most likely have to fight something. But I also want to go ahead and mention the Quantum Cloak. The Quantum Cloak is very good because once you activate it, it makes you disappear for a few seconds and you can escape enemies. And then pretty much the requirement, you're going to need your jetpack and the cybernetic arm. It is one of the best ways to get around quickly, and I'm also going to show you a technique that you can use with the cybernetic arm a little later in this video. Like I said earlier, you're going to occasionally run into some enemies, so I think you want to have at least some weapons that are able to handle those enemies. And I like the Space-Time Rift and the Magnetic Storm. The reason being is both of those can group up the enemies and do quite a bit of damage, with the Space-Time Rift debuff and Magnetic Storm just doing a lot of damage. So now that that's out the way, let me go ahead and discuss the damage set. So again, I'm going to use the Space-Time Rift and the Magnetic Storm for the reasons I said earlier, and Kuant and Hologram Projector, because Kuant level 2, once that shield breaks, we're going to get a damage boost, and Hologram Projector, it can make an extra clone of you, so it can be distracting for the mobs, and it can also bring you extra damage. But just because this is a damage set, we still need to get around, so of course we're going to have our jetpack and our cybernetic arm. So the one thing that I definitely had to show you was the grapple technique, and basically it's like when you grapple to a location, when you're in mid grapple and you switch your relics, you're going to get that forward momentum, and if you do it right, you can gain a lot of distance, as you see here. If you found this helpful, I greatly appreciate a like so that way it can spread more on YouTube. Next, I want to go ahead and discuss the vehicles that I think are going to probably be the best when trying to get around Greyspace. I think the very best one is the Chaser mount because it allows you to hover and it doesn't get caught on a lot of things. But if you don't have the Chaser mount, you can consider using from the battle pass mount that we got, which is like the little scooter. And if you don't have that, then you can just kind of go with the cube, which everybody should have. And another thing to be aware of is the Simulacrum trait. Now, if you're just going to kind of go around and explore, you could consider actually just getting the Hilda trait, because this will allow you to move 10% faster on a vehicle. But if you're going to be going after those stargates, you definitely want to make sure you have the right Simulacrum activated. And once you have your right Simulacrum activated, make sure you have the right gear set selected. And I also recommend that you go ahead and give yourself a food buff so that way you can power yourself up. You might also want to consider doing Mia's Kitchen as well. On top of that is also having a good food on your food bar. One food that I like is Snow Lotus Soup. You can use that to help regenerate endurance. So that way, if you're using someone like Samir, you can go back in the air and spin to win. But I also want to discuss one last thing, and that is the bosses inside the Greyspace. Now, where you see the bosses in the real world, that's mainly where the bosses are located. So where Magma is, that's where you're going to find the Abyssant Reaver, and where Rudolph is, that's where you're going to find the Opera Singer. And where you can find the Well boss is located down here, pretty much where you see this brown dot under Mioria City. That's where you can find the Well boss. But you want to be really careful when it comes to these bosses, and you might want to save those for last. You're going to need a strong Shatterer, and they do a lot of damage. Remember, if you die, you instantly get kicked out of the gray zone. So I recommend that if you are going to go fight a boss, you want to make that your first priority and go fight those right away. On top of that, we do have Greyspace scriptures. Now you can use these to instantly get into the Greyspace at the location that you're at. So one way to go fight the bosses is to get to that boss location, then use the Greyspace scripture, and then you can fight it right away. But I don't recommend using these unless the bosses are the last thing you need out of the Greyspace. And one thing that I wanted to mention, if you've been slacking on the exploration like me, one thing that you want to pick up is the side quest in Mioria Archives. Okay, once inside, you want to talk to the lady on the right hand side. So she will give you a quest which starts a 2-part quest chain until she gives you another quest to where it's called Visitors from the Outside, to where you need to kill enemies in the Greyspace. But with that, you should know everything you need to know to be prepared for the Greyspace. But here's the last thing that I did want to show you. You can monitor your progress by going to the map and clicking on each area. So we take a look at Sandstorm Ground. You can see up top here you have a Greyspace section. So far I have completed 10% of the Sandstorm Grounds. I got 7 space rifts and I got 7 crystal dust out of 130. But again, I do recommend that you just use the interactive map, because even if you are moving a little bit slower, it's really going to hurt when you're looking for 1 more crystal dust or 1 more space rift. If you found this video helpful, feel free to subscribe. I do daily videos every day to help with progression and to help prevent you making mistakes. But other than that, talk to you guys later.